really kind of self-immolating with alcoholism, and it was a shock. I don't know.
At first glance, Diane Lane's life seems like a Hollywood fairy tale. Early stardom, timeless beauty, and a career that always kept her in the spotlight. But look closer, and a very different picture emerges. Behind the glamour was a childhood marked by turmoil and an industry that often failed to give her the recognition she deserved. Lane faced battles both deeply personal and undeniably professional. Now, at 60, she carries those scars quietly, her grace masking the hardships she's endured. To many, she's the image of a classic movie star, but the reality of her life today tells a story far more bittersweet. The strange childhood that forged a star. Diane Lane's story begins in New York City, where she was born on January 22, 1965. Her mother, Colleen Farrington, lived a colorful life as a nightclub singer, Playboy centerfold, game show co-host, and actress. Her father, Burton Eugene Lane, was deeply rooted in theater, working as a drama coach in Manhattan, running a workshop with John Cassavetes, driving a cab, and eventually teaching at City College. The marriage unraveled almost instantly. Less than 2 weeks after Diane's birth, Colleen filed for divorce and moved to Georgia. That left Diane in the care of her father, who raised her while living in hotels and riding around in his cab. Their bond was unusually close. He often described her as the perfect child and eventually became her manager. At just 6 years old, Burton put Diane on stage with the La Mama Experimental Theater Club for her first role in Medea. She later admitted that she didn't even know what a play was at the time. Her world was cartoons and children's shows, but she landed the part, reciting lines in Greek. And from there, the stage became her second home. She went on to perform in productions like Electra, The Trojan Women, As You Like It, and The Cherry Orchard, gaining experience far beyond her years. Still, she wasn't always thrilled about acting. In her teens, she confessed to feeling conflicted, unsure if she wanted to commit to such a demanding life. Her theater troupe often traveled internationally, sometimes leaving her in less than ideal care. During one trip to Amsterdam, she accidentally ate hash brownies. The company performed in ancient ruins and bold, often shocking productions featuring nudity and raw depictions of violence. Despite the chaos, Diane remembered the era fondly, an adventurous mix of freedom, experimentation, and cultural exchange. She even carried a tortoise she bought in Paris in a crocheted pouch around her neck, a quirky reminder of the times. By age 12, her talent caught the eye of director George Roy Hill, best known for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He cast her in A Little Romance, alongside Laurence Olivier, who famously called her the next Grace Kelly. The role pushed her into Hollywood's spotlight, landing her on the cover of Time magazine under the headline, Hollywood's Whiz Kids. While most teenagers might have crumbled under that kind of pressure, Diane handled it with surprising perspective. She later recalled seeing her face on the cover and realizing it was more publicity stunt than a personal achievement. Even then, she understood that fame often relied less on talent and more on timing, connections, and powerful people pulling strings. Her early fame brought opportunities but also challenges. Schoolwork became harder to balance with her acting career, and she admitted to wanting a normal childhood. At one point, she even considered leaving acting behind to pursue interests in ecology. But her father convinced her that turning down a film with Olivier was unthinkable. From then on, Hollywood became her path. Life at home grew more complicated as she entered her mid-teens. At 15, she ran away with a friend to Los Angeles. When she returned, her relationship with her father had fractured, and she began living with friends. Her relationship with her mother was rocky as well. At one point, Colleen tried to forcibly take her to Georgia, an incident Diane later described as traumatic. The two didn't speak for years, but eventually reconciled. In Hollywood, Diane navigated the darker sides of the industry with a sharp awareness well beyond her age. She avoided predatory figures by instinctively steering clear, though she still faced deeply inappropriate experiences on set. During one film, studio executives with no connection to the production showed up to watch her nude scenes, a situation she later described as degrading and exploitative. It happened more than once, with visits timed for the days she would be most vulnerable. Still, she carried herself professionally, refusing to let those moments define her. Her mother's past as a Playboy model added another layer of complexity. Interviewers often tried to draw parallels between their experiences. Diane chose to keep those reflections private, respecting her mother's own desire to tell her story in her own way. By the time Diane Lane hit her teenage years, she already had an impressive list of films under her belt. That momentum carried her straight into one of her standout roles, Francis Ford Coppola's Rumblefish in 1983. The movie came from S.E. Hinton's novel, and while it wasn't a direct sequel to The Outsiders, it shared the same universe, kind of like how Hinton's That Was Then, This Is Now ties into the same world without being a follow-up. While Coppola was directing The Outsiders, he and Hinton began shaping Rumblefish into something different from a straightforward adaptation. What they created was more of an experimental companion piece. From the opening frame, the film feels unlike anything else. Shot entirely in black and white, with a hypnotic score by Stuart Copeland, it has a dreamlike, or at times nightmarish quality that sets it apart from the more conventional storytelling of The Outsiders. The plot follows two brothers, played by Matt Dillon and Mickey Rourke, as they stumble through a turbulent youth. Lane plays Rourke's girlfriend, who becomes entangled in a love triangle with a character played by a young Nicolas Cage. At first, critics didn't know what to make of it. Many dismissed it as overly stylized or difficult to follow. But over time, Rumblefish gained a cult reputation and is now widely considered one of Coppola's boldest achievements. Interestingly, both Rumblefish and The Outsiders were filmed back-to-back, using many of the same cast and crew. Alongside Lane and Dillon, the productions also featured Tom Waits and Glenn Withrow, giving both films a unique sense of continuity. After Rumblefish, Lane's career took an unexpected turn. She began turning down high-profile roles, including the lead in Splash, which eventually went to Daryl Hannah and became a breakout success. In 1984, she starred in The Cotton Club with Richard Gere, but soon after, she made a decision that most young actors in Hollywood would never dare to make. At just 19 years old, Lane stepped back from the industry altogether. She packed up and moved to Georgia, trading the non-stop grind of Hollywood for something quieter. To her, it felt less like walking away, and more like turning the page to a new chapter. The break only lasted a year, but in an industry that moves at lightning speed, that was enough to make people talk. By the time she came back, the press was already calling it a comeback, a word that caught her off guard, considering how short her pause had been. From then on, Lane leaned toward independent films and smaller studio projects, carving out a path that felt more her own. Diane Lane and Bon Jovi's Secret. In the 1980s, Diane Lane's love life drew plenty of attention. Though she rarely spoke openly about it, one of her earliest relationships was with actor Timothy Hutton. The two met at a Hollywood event, and their romance took off quickly. They became a familiar sight at glamorous parties, bonded by their shared passion for acting. Eventually, the spark faded, but their friendship remained intact even after the breakup. Not long after, in 1985, she crossed paths with a young musician still calling himself John Bon Jovi. Soon enough, the world would know him as John Bon Jovi, the frontman of the band that carried his name to global fame. Back then, Bon Jovi had just dropped their debut album and were gaining traction with their second 7,800 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a whirlwind of tours, parties, and big dreams. And Lane was right there in the middle of it. She later admitted the romance only lasted about 5 months, but she remembered it as fun, lighthearted, and carefree. The kind of memory that shines a little brighter when you look back on your youth. She even kept personal photographs from that time, including some that captured the lighter side of life on tour. One set showed Bon Jovi himself packing for the road, with rows of jock straps laid out on the floor for the entire band to get through the long journey ahead. It was a behind-the-scenes glimpse into the unpolished, often chaotic world of rising rock stars. Over the years, rumors swirled that Bon Jovi's hit song, "You Give Love a Bad Name," was inspired by Lane. While the story was often repeated, she brushed it off, pointing out that the lyrics didn't quite line up with who she was. The end of their relationship came quickly, and, according to those close to the band, with a touch of drama. In the book Sex, Drugs, and Bon Jovi, former tour manager Rich Bozett wrote that John ended things after becoming jealous. What had first drawn him to Lane, her free-spirited, party-loving energy, eventually became a source of tension. She was said to have gotten too close to guitarist Richie Sambora, a situation that not only ended her romance with Bon Jovi, but also created friction within the band. By the late 1980s, Diane found herself linked with French actor Christopher Lambert. From the jump, their relationship didn't fit neatly into any box. She once admitted it wasn't exactly love, and it wasn't exactly lust. It was just this strange connection they shared. But once they married, the cracks started to show. Lambert was away a lot, and that distance made real intimacy hard to come by. Looking back, Lane even admitted he was probably the last person who could give her the closeness she was really searching for. The couple married in 1988, and 6 years later, in 1993, they divorced. Before their separation, they welcomed a daughter, Eleanor Lambert. Diane named her after her grandmother and also chose the name because it worked well in both English and French, honoring both her heritage and her husband's. At one point, Lambert had suggested the name Baby, but Lane pushed back, feeling it sounded more like a pin-up name than a timeless one. Only a month after giving birth, Lane was back at work on the set of Oldest Living Confederate Widow Tells All, balancing a newborn, and her career was far from easy. She later admitted that being away from Eleanor during that time was heartbreaking, especially when her baby transitioned from breastfeeding to bottle feeding in her absence. The stress was so overwhelming that, once filming wrapped, she impulsively cut off all her hair. Motherhood quickly redefined her priorities. For Diane, nothing mattered more than her daughter. She often explained that everything else could fall away, but as long as she had Eleanor, that was enough. Determined to raise her daughter outside the chaos of Hollywood, she built a consistent, grounded life away from the spotlight. She believed that celebrities who were constantly trailed by paparazzi were often those who sought out those same places where photographers waited. For Diane, it was simple. Avoid the scene, and you avoid the cameras. How Diane Lane's career defied Hollywood rules. By 1987, Diane Lane was back on screen with two very different projects: The Big Town, opposite Matt Dillon, and the erotic thriller Lady Beware. At the time, the industry had an unspoken rule. If an actor chose a smaller, non-studio film, they had to follow it up with a big-budget studio picture. Lane remembered feeling the pressure to balance those choices, almost as if her work needed to be legitimized by a studio project. Looking back, she found it ironic, since today most Oscar-winning performances come from independent films rather than big studio productions. Hollywood in the late 1980s and early 1990s offered Lane some major opportunities, roles that could have changed her career trajectory entirely. One of the most famous was Pretty Woman, Before Julia Roberts landed the role of Vivian Ward, Lane was seriously considered. At the time, the script was much darker and more dramatic than the romantic comedy audiences now know. Lane decided to pass, and by the time the project was reworked into a lighter, more playful film, it had already moved on. Pretty Woman wasn't the only blockbuster she turned down. She also walked away from splash and risky business. While she admitted to wondering about the roles she didn't take, she believed that constantly dwelling on missed opportunities was no way to live. Through the 1990s, Lane built a steady career with a mix of projects. She appeared in films ranging from the action-heavy Judge Dredd to the family drama My Dog Skip and the thriller The Glass House. But it wasn't until 2002 that her career truly reignited with a performance that reminded Hollywood of her depth and talent. That year, she starred in Unfaithful, directed by Diane Lane, alongside Richard Gere and Olivier Martinez. The story followed a suburban wife, Connie Sumner, whose chance encounter with a younger man led her into a passionate and dangerous affair. What made the film stand out wasn't just its mix of suspense and seduction, it was Lane's performance. She captured Connie's conflicted emotions so vividly that audiences felt her desire, guilt, and unraveling in every frame. One scene in particular, set on a train as Connie relives her first intimate moment with her lover, became iconic. It also came with a hidden cost. Filming required multiple takes of a physically demanding kissing scene with Martinez. Lane had to hold her position under his weight while staying camera-ready, and after nearly 50 takes, her neck gave out. The pain became so severe that she later needed an MRI, and even today, she continues to deal with lingering effects from the injury. The strain is visible in parts of the film, especially in a scene where she delivers lines while lying down because it was the only way she could manage the pain. That level of commitment made her performance feel raw and authentic, and it earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress, the first of her career. Despite the buzz, Lane stayed true to herself. On the night of the 2002 Oscars, when most nominees would be walking the red carpet, she skipped the ceremony altogether. She had gowns and jewelry ready, but chose instead to stay in with a close friend, enjoying a quiet evening away from the spotlight. For her, authenticity mattered more than appearances. That nomination, however, shifted her standing in the industry. For the first time, she found herself with the kind of influence where her commitment could get a film financed and greenlit. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly. Rather than seeing it as a power trip, she viewed it as a reminder to remain thoughtful about her choices. Lane never wanted fame to change her. Even with newfound recognition and influence, she continued to approach her work with the same perspective she always had: grounded, deliberate, and deeply aware of the weight her decisions could carry. Diane Lane's love story gone wrong. In 2002, Diane Lane and Josh Brolin crossed paths at the premiere party for the film A Beautiful Mind. They weren't strangers. They had met years earlier on a film set, sharing small talk over a craft services table, but this time was different. At the party, Brolin reintroduced himself, and that simple moment sparked something new between them. The connection grew quickly. Both had lived in the public eye for years, yet they shared an outlook that celebrity wasn't the center of their lives. That sense of ease drew them closer. About a year and a half later, on the 4th of July, Brolin proposed. The couple married on August 14, 2004, at his ranch just north of Los Angeles. Surrounded by family and close friends, the celebration included Brolin's father, James Brolin, his stepmother, Barbara Streisand, and actress Elizabeth Perkins. For both, this was a second chance at marriage. Lane had been married to actor Christopher Lambert, with whom she shares a daughter, Eleanor. Brolin's first marriage was to actress Alice Adair, and together they have 2 children, Trevor and Eden. By 2004, their families blended, And for a time, it looked like the start of a lasting partnership. But 9 years later, the marriage came to an end. What seemed like a Hollywood romance built to last had quietly unraveled. Just months after Diane Lane and Josh Brolin married, trouble struck. In December 2004, Brolin was arrested at their home and charged with spousal battery after Lane called the police, saying he had struck her. He was released on bail, and soon after, the couple's spokesperson described the incident as a misunderstanding and emphasized that Diane did not want to press charges. Despite the rocky start, the two seemed to recover and carried on with their marriage. By 2005, Lane spoke warmly about Brolin, describing him as a source of strength and stability in her life. Having already been through one marriage with actor Christopher Lambert, she was cautious about introducing a new partner to her daughter Eleanor, but felt secure enough with Brolin to embrace their blended family. She praised his energy and admitted he made her feel complete in ways that surprised her. Parenting teenagers became one of Lane's biggest challenges. Between her own daughter and Brolin's daughter, she suddenly found herself guiding two teenage girls through the maze of adolescence. She described the experience as humbling, frustrating, and at times overwhelming, especially when boys entered the picture. A book about parenting teenagers shifted her perspective, teaching her that parents don't always need to explain themselves. Sometimes the role of a parent is simply to set boundaries and stick to them. Lane adopted this approach, learning to hold firm even when her daughter pushed back. Motherhood and advocacy often overlapped for her. In 2008, she traveled with Eleanor to Rwanda on a trip with Heifer International. It was a life-changing journey for both, and Lane cherished the fact that her daughter could witness firsthand the fight against poverty and hunger. Eleanor took photographs throughout the trip, and Lane later reflected on how profoundly the experience changed her daughter's outlook. Parenting in a blended family wasn't always smooth. Lane admitted that Brolin was often stricter than she was, more willing to take the unpopular role of disciplinarian. She tended to be the peacemaker, sometimes even accused by her daughter of being harder on her than on her stepdaughter. Lane acknowledged the truth in that and tried to approach her stepdaughter more as a supporter than an enforcer. Still, she appreciated Brolin's firmer hand and believed that together they balanced each other. Most importantly, the two girls formed a close bond that eased the family dynamic. But Brolin's struggles with the law continued to make headlines. In 2008, he was arrested during a bar fight in Louisiana, though the charges were later dropped. Then, on New Year's Day 2013, he was arrested for public intoxication in California. He appeared in public shortly after without his wedding ring, fueling speculation about the state of their marriage. Within weeks, the couple confirmed their separation and plans to divorce, describing the decision as mutual and amicable. The separation had in fact begun earlier, though the official paperwork arrived on Valentine's Day 2013, when Lane signed the divorce papers. She requested that her legal name be restored to Diane Lane, citing irreconcilable differences. By December of that year, the divorce was finalized, ending 9 years of marriage. Brolin later admitted that his behavior during those years was chaotic. He reflected on the mistakes he made, acknowledging that drinking often pushed him into reckless, self-destructive decisions. He described how alcohol stripped away his judgment, leaving him restless and impulsive. Looking back, he admitted he had taken on a misguided hero role in his relationship with Lane, trying to meet every need and insecurity until the effort left him drained and resentful. He loved being a father figure to her daughter, but over time, the weight of that dynamic became too much. After the divorce, Brolin sought help, entering rehab and committing to sobriety. He quit smoking, remarried, and built a healthier life with his new wife, Catherine Boyd. In reflecting on his past, he recognized how destructive his choices had been, but he also acknowledged that the collapse of his marriage with Lane pushed him toward the changes that ultimately saved him. The secret struggle behind her smile. By 2016, Diane Lane had reached a turning point. At 51 years old, she was done with the insecurities that had once shadowed her and embraced middle age with a sense of calm. She admitted that it had taken some work to get there. She had, in her own words, rehearsed 50. Instead of fearing it, she studied it, prepared for it, and decided not to let age become something terrifying. By then, she felt cozy in her own skin, no longer clinging to the idea of staying 29 forever, and no longer apologizing for not being what others expected her to be. That level of confidence hadn't always come easily. As a child, Lane had faced rejection in ways that left lasting marks. At only 12 years old, the legendary modeling scout Eileen Ford dismissed her not because of her talent, but because she believed Lane's neck was too short. While other girls were told their noses were too big or their ears stuck out, Lane carried that unusual critique for years. Like anyone else, she continued to wrestle with self-doubt. She had a way of keeping perspective, though. She believed that improvement was always possible and liked to remind herself that everyone has good and bad days. One morning, her hair might fall perfectly. The next, her thighs might bother her. To her, that was simply the human condition. Everyone is vulnerable to insecurities, comparisons, and disappointments. Still, she was critical of the culture that fueled those insecurities, especially for women. Growing up, she saw ads that pushed competition among women, making beauty into something weaponized. It left her with the impression that women weren't allowed to claim confidence without facing judgment or backlash. She recognized that entire industries thrived on keeping women doubtful about themselves, and she often reflected on how damaging that had been. By this stage of her life, 3 years after her divorce from Josh Brolin, Lane was learning to enjoy her independence. She traveled alone, embraced solitude, and leaned into the freedom of not needing to answer to anyone. At the same time, she admitted that relationships with men had always been among her greatest challenges. She described them as disorienting, like losing a compass, where gravity shifts and nothing feels steady. That struggle humbled her, forcing her to balance her instinct to please others with the need to keep herself whole. She remained open to love, but she also found deep satisfaction in being on her own. For Diane Lane, middle age became less about holding on to what had been lost and more about embracing what she had gained: clarity, resilience, and the quiet strength of self-acceptance. Why Diane Lane almost quit acting recently? When Diane Lane first stepped into Hollywood, the landscape wasn't particularly welcoming for women seeking meaningful roles. For years, she found herself playing recycled stereotypes, the same shallow characters over and over. By the time the industry began slowly shifting toward writing richer roles for women over 40, Lane had already endured her fair share of one-dimensional scripts. Looking back, she didn't dwell on bitterness, but she did admit that she always had a wide range of abilities that simply weren't being tapped into. In more recent years, Lane has found the chance to play women with real depth. Her performance as Slim Keith in FX's Feud, Capote vs. The Swans allowed her to channel both resilience and vulnerability. Preparing for the role meant revisiting her own difficult memories. She understood her character's strength, especially the way Slim Keith learned to survive by refusing to let men control her. Lane drew on her own childhood, remembering what it was like to be caught between two parents during a painful custody battle, to understand the core wounds of the woman she was portraying. Her path into acting had been unconventional from the very beginning. At 7 years old, she joined the La Mama Experimental Theater Club in New York, and by the age of 12, she was sharing the stage with Meryl Streep. A few years later, she ran away to Los Angeles, only to be brought back to Georgia by her mother against her will, sparking a court battle with her father. Those formative years left her with a deep understanding of fractured family bonds, an experience she later brought into her acting. Feud Capote Verses. The Swans dramatized the real-life rift between author Truman Capote and the socialites who once adored him. When Capote published a scandalous chapter of his unfinished novel in Esquire magazine in 1975, the women quickly recognized themselves in his thinly veiled characters. Feeling betrayed, they cut him off completely, vowing revenge. Lane stepped into the role of Slim Keith, a glamorous figure who lived at the center of high society, connected to powerful men and cultural icons like Howard Hawks, William Powell, Randolph Hearst, and Ernest Hemingway. Alongside Lane, the show featured Naomi Watts as Babe Paley, Chloe Sevigny as CZ Guest, Callista Flockhart as Lee Radziwill, Demi Moore as Anne Woodward, and Molly Ringwald as Joanne Carson. Tom Hollander played Capote himself, supported by Treat Williams, Jessica Lange, and Russell Tovey in key roles. The series went on to receive 5 Emmy nominations in 2024, including nods for Gus Van Sant's direction and acting nominations for Naomi Watts, Tom Hollander, and Treat Williams. Diane Lane earned her own nomination for Outstanding Supporting Actress, her 3rd Emmy recognition following Lonesome Dove in 1989 and Cinema Verite in 2011. She later explained that she drew on her mother's strength to carry her through the emotional demands of the role. The camaraderie among the cast became another highlight of the project. Jessica Lange reflected on how easily they all bonded, describing it as the natural closeness of a circus family. That sense of connection tied back to Lane's own history, as she often mentioned her father, Burton Eugene Lane, who had taught acting in New York and once counted John Cassavetes and Gina Rowlands among his friends. Lane's career longevity is striking. In 2024, she appeared not only in Feud, but also in Netflix's A Man in Full, an impressive 45 years after her film debut in A Little Romance at just 14. Having recently turned 60, she remains as radiant as ever, her presence carrying the same effortless charm that first made her a star. Through all the ups and downs of Hollywood, Lane has kept her perspective grounded. She acknowledges regrets, but frames them as part of survival. Inspired as a child by Muhammad Ali's ability to stay standing no matter how many blows he took, Lane built her philosophy on endurance. For her, the key is simple: never go down, never give up, and never let one misstep define the journey. And when she flashes that unmistakable smile, it becomes clear why Diane Lane has remained captivating for more than 4 decades. Even when she insists on humility, her presence alone confirms what audiences have always known. She is, without question, a true movie star.